The first frost sketched its pale breath across the cypress knees and the cracked panes of the kitchen window, so that the world outside looked like a picture hidden beneath ice. Morel Andrew rose before the rooster's second cry, palm running the grain of the pine table the way a violinist wakes a sleeping bow. The kitchen was a ship and she its quiet captain, the hearth a furnace heart that could burn or bless, the knives a choir of silver tongues, the kettles muttering like old ants. She listened, as she always did, for the particular truce of dawn, rats gone still, coals sighing, the yardman's chains of buckets clinking far away at the pump. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. Morel's fingers found the chalk knob she kept tucked behind the brick where grease never reached. She drew a single letter, S, on the underside of the table's lip and wiped it away with the heel of her hand. No one ever looked there. No one knew the table had become a book. In the quiet that followed, she could hear the words in her head like dried beans rolling from palm to palm: simmer, scald, steep, salt. Words that had not been given to her but stolen and stitched, gleaned from a dropped newspaper, from a trifled child's primer left by the back steps, from the Bible she cooked for, the words softened in gravy, hid in pies, delivered between courses like contraband. Literacy lived in her like a second hunger. "Morning, Miss Morel," muttered Tombeau, the boy she'd grown into a copper pot and who pretended to know nothing except fire. He was 11 and made of wick and tinder, his eyes tallow bright. He had seen her chalking once and looked away with an understanding that only children and owls possess. "You keep the ash quiet," she told him, though Ash had always loved him and did not betray. "And fetch me that jar. The one with the star anise I traded for in the smokehouse." He brought it, his small hands reverent about the lid. She lifted its smell and the room shifted, licorice dark, river cold, a note from far ports no one here had seen. The mistress liked to dream she was worldly. Morel let her dream, laying exotic shadows into broths as if the kitchen were a map that only she could read. The White family called it Thanksgiving now because the papers said so, because the mistress had a sister in New Orleans who had written breathless about parades and sermons, about gratitude made fashionable. The master called it the feast, older in him than any proclamation, a day to eat loud, to count his cotton like coins of God, to make the people who cooked it stand invisible in their glory. Morel set the iron skillet upon the fire with a care that could have tendered a heart. She was not thinking of hearts. She was thinking of how silence takes shape in a room, and how it can be broken with a spoon's simple tap. She was thinking of time. The kitchen clock, a brass mouth with a broken tooth, told the wrong hours but the right rhythm. She had learned to read it anyway, the slow measure of dough rising, the speed of a roux darkening from sand to copper to mahogany, the moment at which cider turns from singing to speechless. If the day was to hold what she had begun to imagine, she would need to be exact. "Your mind's got corners today," said Nanette, who came in with her apron already wet from yard dew and her sleeves rolled to elbows the color of pecans. Nanette's laugh could cut rope from a man's neck, Nanette's eyes could also tie it. "You counting your blessings?" "I'm counting," Morel said, and left it there. Sometimes the safest truths are simply smaller parts of larger ones. Nanette set to the chopping with the firm patience of someone who had survived 3 masters and 2 droughts, who had birthed 6 children and buried 2. She had taught Morel how to tuck garlic into bread as if whispering a psalm into a lover's ear. She had wrapped Morel's bleeding finger once in the clean part of her skirt and told her that knives, like men, respect only those who respect themselves. The bond between them had been soldered by heat long ago. The kitchen door creaked and the yardman called Baptiste's name down the hallway as if it were a dog. Baptiste appeared in the doorway a breath later, hat in his hands, river still on his boots. He worked the skiff at the bayou's curve and smuggled nothing but fish and, once in a while, the rumor of elsewhere. Today he stood with a gunny sack and a look that said he carried more than catfish. "Got your persimmons," he said to Nanette, and then looked at Morel too long, the way people look when they are not looking at you but at the thought of you. He was careful with his eyes. He had to be. Everyone did. Tombeau took the sack and set it on the table. The smell rose sunsour and sweet at once, a fruit that goes to honey only when frost has kissed it, a fruit that knows patience's price. Morel cupped one and felt the shape of the day in it, hardness holding a secret sugar. They posted a notice, Baptiste murmured, keeping his voice inside the room like steam. There's a new patrol calls itself the Great. They make a show of checking windows. Counting heads before dawn. They say the law frowns on gatherings. Nanette snorted. Law don't frown. Law smiles with thin lips and tells you how many teeth it got. Morel wiped her hands on her apron and met Baptiste's gaze, not like a woman meets a man but like a thought meets a plan. We gather to cook, she said. If they wish to count, let them count the things that feed them. Baptiste's mouth softened. He had once watched her debone a fish without breaking the skin and called it a miracle of patience. He had once placed in her palm a line from a newspaper rolled like a cigarette, Thanksgiving, the family altar of gratitude. That line had burned in her. To whom was gratitude owed? To fields. To rivers. To women whose hands brought harvest to mouth. To children who slept only when the pots quieted. Not to the man who would sit at the head of the table and pronounce himself a blessing. Before the day had a name, before any feast, there was hunger that learned to speak softly. There was a girl who learned to read from the way fire licked wood, from the way heat moved through a stew like a story deepening. Morel remembered the first time she had pushed her ear against the table to hear the world on the other side of wood, footsteps of men counting barrels, the mistress rehearsing her manners aloud as if heaven could hear, a boy reciting the alphabet so lazily the letters fell asleep between his lips. The boy had been asked to spell gratitude. He had spelled it wrong and thrown the primer at the wall. Morel had picked it up later with hands that trembled but did not shake. Trembling is what you do inside. Not shaking was how you live. She drew up a list now in her mind and then on the underside of the table in the white that only she in the dark could see. Pepper. Clove. Star anise. River salt. Vinegar. Tansy, no, not for stew. For the flies that would try for the pies. She wrote the names of herbs like the names of saints, then wiped them away and kept them written in her. Outside, the house was waking in the way that houses do, shutters yawning like teeth, a piano complaining about the damp in the front room, the master coughing out his morning brandy as if it were a demon that refused to be baptized. The mistress crossed the yard with her skirts lifted just enough to betray her ankles to the morning. She liked to catch Morel at work and pronounced them both companions in industry. She would not wash a pot. She would pat one. Morel, she said, and the name felt on her tongue like a coin she expected to spend. You'll see to the turkey yourself. Mr. Anjou, she took pleasure in saying the name as if it were French because it was, because some long ago Creole ancestor had cast it into the delta like seed, once it brined with molasses and oranges like we had in '57 when the bishop came. Yes, ma'am, said Morel, who knew that the year was not '57 and that no bishop had come. The mistress wore her memory like lace, ornate, full of holes, convinced the pattern was the point. And the punch, the mistress continued. Will be 15 adults, counting Mr. Harrow and his eldest. 3 children who can be given watered cider. We will say the blessing at 2. The preacher is dead of the fever, so Mr. Harrow will likely speak. He's a man of such robust feeling. She smiled as if she had invented the phrase. You will have everything ready, and for once we will be on northern time. Everything will be ready, Morel said, and the words sounded like a lid closing softly. When the mistress left, Nanette leaned close. Heard the patrol came through the quarters last night, she murmured. Asking did anyone sell sassafras root to children. As if root makes rebellion. Everything makes rebellion, Morel said. Sugar. Salt. Silence. Even root. Nanette's eyes searched her face. You got a thing on your tongue. Spit it or swallow it, child. Morel lifted the turkey from the salt bath and laid it on the table. It looked like a white hem that had lost its music. She ran her hand beneath the skin to loosen it for herbs, the way she had been taught, the way she had taught others. I intend, she said slowly, for them to eat the truth. Nanette's knife stopped. Truth can be a poison if a body ain't ready. I ain't speaking of poison. Morel's lips barely moved. I'm speaking of appetite. Tombeau, who had been humming to the fire, hummed louder to drown meaning. The kitchen had ears in the walls, but the walls didn't know how to cook. What had begun as a whisper in her chest the winter before had gathered now like thickening gravy, like storm milk pulled from the sky's breast. She had been witness to counting for too long. The master counted bales, counted debts paid by other people's lives, counted his son's good fortune as proof of providence. It was time, Morel thought, that they learned to count something else. An old woman named Phoebe, who had once been the plantation's midwife and was now kept to the quarters except when pain required her hands, came before 10 and sat by the hearth with her breath rasping like a slow saw. She talked while she shelled pecans with fingers that had brought 60 babies into daylight. You know what they call a family tradition? She asked with no preamble and a smile that had lost its teeth but not its bite. They call it repeating yourself if you poor. They call it tradition if you rich. Same thing, but one smells like orange peel and the other smells like yesterday's shirt. Morel slid the pecan meat into a bowl and nodded. What did your people call it? Phoebe's eyes traveled forward and backward at once, as old eyes will. We called it a wheel. You turn a wheel, you get back to where you started unless someone smart builds you a road. Maybe we build a road today, Morel said, the words tasting like burnt sugar indecision. Phoebe chuckled, then coughed. Girl, roads need signs. Folk need to know which way to go. That's what the kitchen is, Morel whispered. A way to say go without moving your lips. Phoebe looked at her long, weighed something, and nodded like a tree that knows wind by name. You always could read heat better than scripture. By noon, the kitchen had become the center of a universe that pretended otherwise. The boys split wood until their palms gleamed like melted candle wax. Nanette sent a girl to pick watercress from the ditch no one wanted to admit was clean. Baptiste returned from the bayou with oysters that smelled like knives and wind. He set them discreetly near the back door, where Tombeau could praise them without speaking. Pie shells cooled on the sill like pale moons. Morel tasted, adjusted, tasted again, her tongue an instrument tuned to sorrow and survival. Into the punch, she laid slices of orange studded with cloves so that each looked like a map of stars. She measured the molasses with an eye that could portion mercy. She poured in cider and the rum the master kept for bragging, and she whispered the names of the ancestors she knew while she stirred, Sabine who was sold after birthing twins and laughed at the auction, Daniel who built boats from drift and dream, little Effie whose shoulders could fit in your palm and yet she carried her mother's will like a plank, boys whose names had blown away in the first wind but whose laughter still visited the kitchen when the spoons rattled. She did not ask those dead to do anything, she asked only to remember how to stand. Nanette worked the dressing with onions sweated exactly to the softness that keeps a secret. She slid and toasted cornbread and sage that had been dried over the hearth for a week. If I die today, she said, and it was an old joke between them, because cooks die a little each time folk eat without thanks, bury me in this bowl. Don't speak of dying, Morel replied, and her voice was steady water over rock. Speak of endings that are beginnings. In the front house, laughter clanged like spoons. A fiddle started and stopped. The master tried out his toasts in the mirror, practicing jovial humility with a glass he did not spill. He would praise Providence in his own prudence. He would talk of the market and the mercy of rain. He would use the word gratitude like a brand. Morel wiped the edge of a plate with the corner of a clean cloth until its rim shone like a crescent. She had chosen the plates last night, because when you cannot choose the law you learn to choose what touches the law. She set aside 3 with hairline cracks and made a note inside her head where cracks belong. She imagined the way the table would look, a kingdom of white where every stain tells the truth. Were you keeping your letters now? Phoebe asked suddenly, as if she had walked right into Morel's skull. The ones you write and eat up. In my mouth, Morel said, unexpected as a smile. And under the table. Phoebe laughed her saw laugh again. Under the table is where they keep their feet. In your mouth is where they keep your silence. Careful you don't choke on either. Morel met Nanette's eyes. They had talked last night until the fire went to ash and the ash went to memory. There were things Nanette would not do. There were things Morel would not ask. But there were also the children. And there was time, and time is a living creature that grows teeth if you keep it on a leash too long. Tombeau, Morel said, take the small skillet to the smokehouse and warm it over the embers. I want the lard to soften but not run. He nodded and went, nimble with obedience that hid understanding. Baptiste leaned on the doorjamb as if he were part of the house's frame. You said appetite, he murmured. What you mean is memory. I mean the thing the body does against its own command, Morel answered. Hunger. And the thing a country does against its own preaching. Forgetting. He touched the brim of his hat to that thought as if it were a person who had entered the room. I brought you something from the river. She looked up then, sharply. Gift and danger arrive in the same wrapping. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a small bottle stoppered with cork, the glass smoky as if it had been exhaled rather than blown. Anise liqueur, he said. A man at the far bend makes it to drink when his wife sings too shrill. I traded him saltfish. It's strong as a bad truth. Morel took it, weighed it, and set it in the cool shadow at the back of the pantry. She would use a single spoonful for the custard. She would keep the rest for a night when the wind told her what to do with it. At 1, the house bell clanged as if it had choked on its own importance. The first guests arrived with stiff collars and softened morals, their faces already flushed from their own kitchens and their own punch. Mr. Harrow, with the teeth of a fox and the temper of a child, brought his eldest son who thought every woman under 50 was either a prize or a problem. The mistress kissed air and said, gratitude, as if she were handing out handkerchiefs. The master slapped shoulders and said, Providence, as if it were a mare he'd tamed. Morel felt the heat rise and press against her sternum like a question that had waited all its life to demand. She steadied herself with the plainest task she knew, she cut bread. The sound of the knife sawing crust, the smell of yeast and yesterday, the forks clattering lightly as Nanette set them in order, these were her church bells. If she had allowed herself a flashback, it would have been to the night the patrol came for Daniel because someone had said Daniel knew the river better than God. But she had sworn to keep time straight. Straight as a line of dough rolled to the same thickness from end to end. So she kept that memory where it was, a hard pit inside the fruit of the day. She ladled gravy. She laid greens. She dressed the bird with a steady hand and a face that gave nothing away. At the edge of the table, she placed a dish that did not visit the front room often, stewed black-eyed peas with little coins of carrot shining in them like luck. The mistress did not approve of peas at feasts. They made her think of the poor. Morel set them there anyway. She wanted luck in the room. Luck attends the brave the way bees attend honey that got spilled. When the guests had filled their plates and the preacher's substitute had bored God and man equally with a prayer that sounded like tallying, Morel wiped her hands and lifted the punch ladle with all the ceremony of a sword. She had brushed the bowl's lip with lemon to wake the perfume, she had set cloves in it like eyes. She poured, and the glasses filled like small, obedient sons. In that moment, Tombeau trotted in with the small skillet, the lard satiny, and set it on the back of the stove. He didn't look at her, which is a way of looking. Nanette took up the platter of dressing. Baptiste disappeared as he always did when the house filled with men who considered water a servant. Morel's plan, if plan is the word for something so simple it could be mistaken for breathing, had only 3 parts. Part 1 was the kitchen's ordinary excellence, sharpened to a point. Part 2 was a mirror held up to appetite so clear that it cut. Part 3 was the door. She had oiled the dining room hinges herself the night before beneath the pretense of retrieving a dropped spoon. No door should cry out at the hour of a woman's choosing. She had found the latch that stuck in damp weather and worked it free with the tip of Nanette's longest spoon. She had made a map in her head of men's blind spots, where Mr. Harrow's gaze always slid when he smiled, where the master's eyes went when he lied, where the eldest son stared when he thought no one saw him stare at the maid. And she had counted, quietly, the bodies who would need to move and the bodies who would need to stay. Counting is a kind of prayer. It makes numbers into steps. Mrs. Anjou, said the mistress loudly enough to be heard in heaven, has outdone herself. She never remembered Morel's name and always used it for glory. The turkey is a triumph. The molasses, oh, the molasses. Morel turned away to hide a smile that was not a smile. She looked at Nanette, who gave the smallest nod a human neck can make and still be seen. Baptiste touched his temple, a signal only he and Morel and Nanette would have recognized. The skiff is ready, it meant, though the river was a mile through woods. Not a boat, then. A path. A path is a skiff when hands know how to pull the shore toward them. The second sign came as a child's cry from the back porch where the children had been sent to drip their cider and their boredom over the rail. It was a small cry, more question than alarm. But every grown ear in the dining room twitched. The mistress frowned. The master raised a hand. "Finish your plates," he said to the room at large, and to Morel, "See what's the matter." Morel set the gravy down and wiped her hands on a towel that would tell the truth later when she boiled it. She stepped into the hallway where the air was cooler and the paintings were bigger and the mirrors more certain of themselves. Nanette ghosted behind her as far as the threshold and then returned to the dressing like a general who knows where her field is drawn. Tombeau slipped through the scullery, a shadow in a house that mistook light for sight. On the porch, a little girl, Mr. Harrow's youngest, stood with her lower lip tucked in, looking at the yard as if it had insulted her toy. "It smells funny," she announced to the world, and then, more privately, to Morel, "I dropped my ribbon." Morel knelt and retrieved the ribbon from the slat where it had wedged, touched it to her cheek as if anointing it, and gave it back. "Hold tight," she told the child. "The wind likes pretty things." The yard held its breath. The smoke was not coming from the kitchen. It was coming from beyond the kitchen, beyond the scullery, beyond the place where pots were scoured and hope worn thin. It was coming from the sheds by the far fence, where nothing valuable was kept unless you counted things the White family didn't. Old tools. Busted chairs. A cradle with no rock left in it. Morel turned back toward the dining room, her face composed into the grammar of calm. It would do no good to bring panic to a table that made panic its dessert. By the time she reached the doorway, the master had already stood and ordered Mr. Harrow to accompany him for a stroll. Men do not know they are predictable. They think decree is invention. Morel stepped aside with her eyes on the floorboards, and the two men swept past with their napkins balled like surrendered flags. Nanette caught Morel's sleeve the instant the door closed behind them. "Say when," she whispered, so soft it was less a word than a thought twice. Morel looked toward Phoebe, who had not moved, who sat with her hands on her knees the way a midwife sits waiting for the next breath between laborings. Phoebe nodded once. "Now," Morel said, and the word was the opposite of a shout. It was a key turned in a lock that no one had noticed in the wall. Tombeau moved first, because he was a boy and boys move the way lightning thinks. He lifted the small skillet from the stove with a cloth, carried it to the dining room, and set it on the sideboard near the oysters as if it belonged to some future course. In the skillet, under the gloss of softened lard, lay a ribbon of wick that looked like a river cutting through winter fat. He did nothing to it. He only set it where air could find it when a door opened again and wind told it its name. Nanette loosened the curtains just so. Phoebe folded her hands. Baptiste dislodged the two listening shells with his thumbs so that they whispered down the sideboard and landed with the softest clink, a sound like a distant bell at sea. Morel lifted the punch ladle once more and filled the last empty glass, then set the ladle down with ceremony and laid both palms on the table, flat, as if feeling for the heart of the house. She did feel it. The floor thrummed with footsteps hurrying toward the sheds, with the complaint of hinges that hadn't been oiled, with a hawk's shadow slipping over the roof and then gone. "You look like a queen," the eldest son said, drunk enough to tell the truth, to think truth flattery. "I look like a woman standing in her work," she replied, and the room thought it a joke because they did not know how to hear simple sentences when spoken by people who were not meant to speak. A shout rose from beyond the kitchen, male, self-important, fraying at the edges. Then another. The door swung open and wind came with it, lifting the wick in the skillet into a small, serious flame that ate the lard's lip and then waited, as if listening. The master and Mr. Harrow re-entered at once with their faces red and their voices hotter. "Some child's prank," the master declared. "Nothing to worry yourselves with." He did not say the sheds were smoking. He did not say he had not managed to find the bucket in his own yard. He said nothing that would make him small. The little flame answered no one. It leaned, grew, thought about being bigger, and then remembered it had a job and a clock in a room full of linen that liked to kiss. Time did not slow. That is a lie books tell. Time kept its pace. But attention narrowed until it was a thread between 2 points, flame and curtain. Morel did not blink. Nanette did not breathe. Tombeau's hand found the edge of the sideboard like a sailor finds a rail. Baptiste worked his jaw once and then stilled. The flame touched the curtain's hem the way a child touches seawater for the first time, curious, respectful, delighted before it learns the ocean has a memory. The linen took it like a letter. The letter read itself too quickly. The room inhaled. "Fire," said Mr. Harrow, not with fear but with a thrill that told Morel all she needed to know about his heart. The mistress shrieked in a high voice that had never had to do more work than it could refuse. The eldest son knocked his chair back with a clatter that woke the portrait's eyes. The master shouted orders that lost themselves in the folds of the tablecloth, orders like water, and women out, and damn the fool who. Morel took the pitcher of cider and poured it steadily over the place where Flame first learned linen, knowing it would hiss and sulk but not capitulate. Some fires are not for putting out. Some fires are for showing the room itself. She met Nanette's gaze and nodded toward the hall. Nanette reached for the children first, because hearts are made that way. She crooned to them without words and the words fell in line anyway. Phoebe stood up in a single piece, neither stooped by years nor hurried by youth. Baptiste moved to the door and stood there as if he were holding up the lintel by thinking about it. The master lunged for the sideboard. His sleeve caught the edge of the skillet and for a moment the world balanced on the tilt of iron. Morel saw in that tilt the entire story of this house, a thing on the brink, held up by women's wrists and a boy's breath. She did not reach to steady it. She had learned that some steadiness is betrayal by another name. The skillet clanged to the floor. Grease splashed and spit, found the curtain with ease and a sound like praise. The flame wrote faster. "Out," the master bellowed. "Out, all!" Morel's plan's third part unfolded like a napkin snapped to the air. The door was open. The hinges were silent. The path from dining room to yard to woods lay as smooth as a thought finally spoken. She placed herself not in the doorway but beside it, a hand on each arm of the first 2 people who tried to flee, Mrs. Harrow, whose corset was a question God had never answered, and the mistress, whose gratitude was a garment too thin for weather. "This way," Morel said, and what she meant was, there are 2 ways out of a burning room. One takes you to the yard where men count you. One takes you to the woods where you count yourselves. Choose. Mrs. Harrow tore free and ran toward the yard with tiny steps like fast flies. The mistress faltered, eyes wide. She looked at Morel then fully for perhaps the first time since a girl called Morel arrived on a wagon that nobody named Sorrow. Something moved in the mistress's face, empathy's ghost, or fear's aunt in a borrowed hat. "Help me," she whispered. "I am," Morel said, and guided her, not toward the yard at first, but toward a hall that led past the portrait room, past the door that opened to the side steps that led down to the path Baptiste had cleared in the wet leaves behind the smokehouse. "Hold your skirts or they will hold you." Behind them, the men shouted about water. Someone threw a rug at the flame. It coughed and found more rug. The eldest son tried to be a hero, which is to say he tried to be seen. Phoebe shepherded the smaller children with the grace of someone who has told blood where to go all her life. Nanette moved like a clock's good hand, not fast but right, gathering, directing, murmuring names the way saints call towns home. Tombeau, face slick with heat, stood by the pantry and held a small bundle that looked like a loaf and was not. Inside it a book waited, a primer whose corners had been chewed but whose letters worked still. Inside it another book waited, written under a table in chalk on wood and in a mouth with silence, a book with recipes for leaving painted on the inside of faces and hands. "Are we running?" he asked, his voice not child, not man, something that should have been allowed to be both. Morel looked at him, at the door, at the room that kept breathing smoke. Outside, a hawk cried again, nearer now, as if a sky had bent to listen. "We are walking," she said. "Fast." She turned to the dining room one last time. Mr. Harrow was stomping at Flame as if it were a snake that had wronged him personally. The master was shouting at a bucket, at a chair, at a god who had always accommodated him. The eldest son jerked a tablecloth and sent plates crashing like porcelain snow. The portrait watched its own gilded indifference. Morel caught Nanette's sleeve and Baptiste's eye and Phoebe's breath in the same instant. Here was the road. Here was the sign. Here was the hour they had made with their own hands as if time were dough. "Now," she said again, but this time it was not a key. It was a bell. They moved. Through the hall where mirrors told lies. Down the side steps where the wood remembered bare feet. Past the smokehouse where the air was thick with pretend emergency. Into the sliver of woods where the leaves held the imprint of their names. Baptiste went ahead, and the path opened the way rivers do for boats that know how to listen. Behind them, the house began to speak in a tongue it had suppressed, crack, sigh, groan, the grammar of wood returning to the elements that first taught it to stand. Voices broke to pieces and reassembled as something like pleading. The hawk's cry cut through again, a line drawn quickly across the sky as if to underline the sentence of the day. Tombeau tugged at Morel's sleeve. "What if they come?" "They will," she said, not stopping, not slowing. "We are going where their horses forget their names." The path narrowed and then widened, turned and then straightened. The bayou's breath came cool, touched her throat like a wet cloth laid by a nurse's sure hand. Baptiste lifted a branch and beneath it the skiff waited after all, green with quiet, the river wearing it as if it were a thought the water had decided to complete. Nanette looked back once only. "Some will choose the yard," she said. "They will," Morel answered. "We will be waiting beyond choosing." Phoebe, who had seen more births than deaths or else had turned deaths into births by speaking to them as if they were babies, sat one foot in the skiff and then the other. "Hurry," she said kindly, "before the river takes back its mind." Morel turned to the trees and to the smoke that trailed through them like handwriting badly learned. She imagined letters she had swallowed flying out now and arranging themselves between trunks and sky. She imagined the kitchen table flipped and its underside read like scripture by people who laughed in right places and cried where relief demands it. She imagined a feast somewhere without a master at the head, imagined a word for gratitude that did not require forgetting who cooked. A crack behind them, a branch, or a man's foot learning the language of underbrush. Voices. The great. Baptiste's hand was already out. "Come," he said. "The waters. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story." Wet and waiting. Baptiste's sentence broke like a reed under a boot, not from fear but from necessity. Footsteps rattled the understory, the grate's iron hung with the clang of small laws. Morel did not look back. Looking back is for those who have time to forgive themselves. She took Tombeau's bundle, the primer wrapped in cloth, the soft thud of letters like a hidden heartbeat, and put it beneath her apron where her ribs could swear to it. "Nanette," she said. "Phoebe." Names as oars. Names as instructions. They climbed into the skiff in the order of breath, the oldest lungs first, then the fire-bright boy, then the woman with the room in her face for 20 sorrows and 20 more. Baptiste pushed them off with a sound no louder than a prayer said at the wrong table. The bayou received them like a promise kept. Cattails drew shawls around their shoulders, cypress knelt the way elders do when it is time to bless a child's decision. Smoke trailed at the far edge of the water like a handwriting lesson someone had smudged. Morel felt the skiff loosen the plantation's grammar from her bones. Each dip of Baptiste's or rewrote a sentence she had been punished for reading. Tombeau sat forward with both hands on the gunwale, lips pressed thin to keep courage from spilling. "They coming?" he asked without turning his head. "They will keep counting their chairs," Morel answered. "And then count who is missing. The river favors those who know how to be tall by sitting low. A bullet does not sound like it sounds in stories. It sounds like someone biting an apple you cannot see. The apple bit twice to their right. Bark leapt from a cypress and plopped into the water with a petty outrage. The great were bad shots but good at being loud. "Hold," Baptiste murmured. The skiff slid into a bald cypress's shadow so deep it tasted of iron and rain. He set the oar across his knees and let the current learn their names. The greats' voices slid around the trees like eels. A man called another man's surname the way small dogs call thunder. Morel could see the house through a thumb of trees, window light frantic, the dining room learning the oldest language of wood. She could smell molasses turned wicked by heat and linen arguing with flame and losing in the way linen asks to lose when it has suffered hands that did not love it. She tightened her fingers on the primer until the cloth stitched her palm. "Listen," Phoebe whispered, "not to them but to the bayou." The water answered in ripples. A turtle's head notched the surface like a punctuation mark. Behind them, the grate thrashed. Men who do not listen think noise is a machete and go hacking at silence. The skiff moved again, animal slow. "We ain't running," Tombo whispered, repeating the lesson like a verse. "We walking asleep." "We waking quietly," Morel said. She felt their fear like a fire under her feet, useful if you set your pots just right. Above, the hawk cut another line across the sky. She imagined it etching the word for leave. Into the blue. The bayou widened into a small pond under a vault of trees where Spanish moss wore dusk's color even at noon. Baptiste nudged the keel into a crook of roots, slid into the water to his knees, and dragged them through shallows as if the skiff were a wounded thing he intended to save by tenderness alone. On the far side, soft ground that had learned how to keep a secret footstep. "Here," he said. "Where the cedars lean is a deer path. It goes to an old levee the planters forgot when they learned pride. We follow that, we see the road that ain't a road. We take that, we find Big Marais." "Big Marais?" Nanette asked, breathing even now like someone folding linen. "A slough," Baptiste said. "Looks like a mistake on a map. Looks like a room no one locks because no one considers it a room." "Rooms like that saved me twice," Phoebe said. A statement delivered to the trees for notarizing. They went. The path took them single file, Baptiste carving silence, Morel with the bundle under her apron like an unborn word, Tombo with his hand always almost touching her dress, Nanette with her jaw set to a no one outside a kitchen ever learns, Phoebe bringing up the rear with a patience you felt in your spine. The bayou fell behind their ears, the plantation's shouts dimmed into a choral the woods refused to attend. At the levee, grass bladed their skirts with seeds. Morel reached down and let her palm feel the ridge the way a reader feels the spine of a book. Big Marais lay beyond, a platter of still water with a skin so perfect it nearly made a lyre of the wind. Cypress rose from it like staves of a psalm. Frogs officiated the afternoon. "Cross?" Tombo asked, stunned that any water so calm could be anything but a trap. "No," Baptiste said. "We walk its lip like a gossip, close enough to hear, far enough to keep teeth." They walked. Morel counted her steps because counting was how you put yourself in charge of time. 50 for Daniel. 60 for Sabine. 10 for Effie's perfect hands. 20 for the unnamed. 100 for those who would not choose the path today and would need another day built for them tomorrow. Counting was a road. She laid it as she went so others could follow unseen by maps. By evening, when the bayou's breath turned cool and the mosquitoes laid their knives down to sharpen, Baptiste slowed and raised his hand. "Hush now," he said, and the hush wasn't for people. It was for memory. There. A cabin appeared in the trees the way a truth appears in a long lie, ordinary, undeniable, arranged by necessity rather than taste. Its roof wore moss as if time had put hair on it. No smoke rose. No dogs barked. But the yard, 2 chairs, a stump, a pot turned upside down, had the neatness of a heart that had not surrendered tidiness to despair. "Whose?" Nanette asked. "Mine sometimes," Baptiste said. "And mine not at all. It belongs to anyone the river likes that night. A trapper sleeps there. A woman with a raft of children. A man who lost his brother to a sheriff's purse. People who know to leave a little salt when they go. They enter the yard like confessions. Baptiste knocked at the door with his knuckles set to the tune of politeness. From inside, a shuffle, a pause, the soft scrape of a chair leg, the hush of fingers over metal. The door opened a thumb. A face looked out, the eyes weathered into kindness by work. "It you," the woman said to Baptiste, and then, to Morel and the others, "and yours." She left the door open the way some people leave a book open on a table as a promise to themselves. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of cedar and broth and the particular clean that occurs where sorrow and washing meet. A pot sat at the edge of the hearth with its lid ajar like a slack mouth sleeping. Linen hung from pegs. On a shelf lay a little hoard, salt, parched corn, a twist of tobacco, a tin cup with most of its tin still stubborn. "I'm called Zadie," the woman said, and the name fit the room. "I got one rule. You eat, you wash your bowl, you tell me no stories I can't carry without dropping my own." "We'll stay till moonset," Baptiste said. "Then the river carries us farther." "We brought nothing but gratitude." Zadie's mouth tilted. "Gratitude that don't wash bowls is a ghost. Sit." She ladled broth into bowls with a motion that could have been a blessing if she had been the kind to use that word. Morel sat, and the warmth of the bowl in her hands felt like the hearth at home on the one night Mr. Anjou had been too drunk to order anyone cruel. The broth tasted of deer and weeds and a patience that didn't demand thanks. She swallowed, and all the letters she had kept under her tongue for years arranged themselves along her throat and dissolved into muscle. Tombeau ate as if learning a lesson he wanted to pass. Nanette blew each spoonful cool and looked at Phoebe the way a woman looks at a woman when they have done a thing together that cannot be unwoven. Baptiste leaned back and let the room rest its weight on his shoulders for a moment. Zadie watched them without counting them the way people do when they're not going to sell you. After, Morel washed her bowl with careful fingers. Zadie nodded at the care, then patted the stool beside the hearth. "You got that look," she said. "What look?" Morel asked, sitting with her palms flat on her skirt the way she did when the table trembled. "The look of a woman who put a match to something that needed light and now wonders if it needed flame instead." Morel breathed. "I loosened a door," she said. Fire came in like a relative who talks too loud. Zadie chuckled without cruelty. "Houses that hold screams are tinder whether or not you carry a taper." Her gaze softened. "You left some behind." "I guided the mistress to the side steps," Morel said, surprising herself with that confession. "I don't know if I met mercy for her or a line in a map I want to read later. I don't yet know which of those makes me." She did not finish. There wasn't a word she trusted. Zadie's hand touched Morel's wrist with a pressure that said, "Not everything we do has a name at noon." "Maps are drawn twice," she said. "Once by the land and once by the feet that walk it. You making one that can be walked again. Mercy fits both drawings." Phoebe, who had sat with her eyes half shut as if listening to a baby breathe in another room, opened them and smiled slow. "You can forgive yourself later or earlier," she murmured. "Later is kinder." They slept in shifts. Morel lay down last, back against the plank wall, Tombeau's breath syrup slow at her shoulder, Nanette's exhale a tiny saw-through pine, Baptiste's rest like a man who doesn't lie to water, Phoebe humming under everything like a wind you cannot quite see. Morel did not sleep so much as she poured her mind from one vessel into another until the vessels learned each other's shapes. Before moonset, Baptiste's hand touched her ankle and they were up, bowls washed, thanks left in the form of mended leather on a strap and a new peg hammered into an empty place. The next day was a road made of decisions. They could go south to a swale of free people who called themselves by no one's name but their own. They could go north and hazard the line that did not exist on any tree but was carved into the hearts of men with guns. They could go sideways, which is to say they could choose the quiet war of staying close and undoing the house piece by piece until only beams remained and even the beams took root elsewhere. Morel listened to each option the way she listened to a stew, for thinness, for fat, for the note the tongue does not name but misses when it is absent. "We go sideways," she said at last, shocking herself with how the words slid into the world. "We build a kitchen in the woods." "A kitchen?" Tombeau grinned. "In the trees?" "In the trees, in the reeds, in the places where smoke looks like fog and smells like dinner only to those who deserve it. She felt the shape of the thought resolve, not a camp, not a hide, but a room with no walls that moved when needed. We feed those that run. We send back bread with letters in it that a body can read without knowing letters. We use the day they call Thanksgiving to bring folk to the door and then show them the other door. Baptiste's eyes shone with the specific joy of a man who has been asked to build what he already loves. I know 3 places where a fire can sit without telling on itself, he said. And 2 creaks that sound like conversation to mask the noise of pots. Nanette nodded slow. I can make cornbread with a crust that talks. It will tell those who need to hear which path not to take. Phoebe? Morel asked. Phoebe smiled the way a midwife smiles when she feels the baby turn right. Child, I will bring them through. Thus began a new calendar not written in any almanac, a feast of leaving. They built the first kitchen beneath a cypress that had stood through floods and boasts. Baptiste rigged a tripod from saplings. Morel and Nanette banked coals in a shallow pit lined with clay Zadie guided them to. Tombeau carried water as if he were baptizing the ground itself. Phoebe sat with a vine-wrapped frame across her knees and knotted cords that could tell a story when you ran your fingers over them. They called it, among themselves, the long table. Not because it was long in wood but because it extended from the bayou to anywhere a person decided to bend their knees and eat without apology. The first to come found them by accident. Or providence, if that word meant the world when it was kind. A man named Saul who had jumped the ditch at Perdido rather than watch his wife sell in December. He came with blood in his sock and refusal in his back. He looked at the pot like it had spoken his mother's name, then at Morel as if asking if forgiveness had a lid he could lift. Sit, she said. You walked farther than you think. He sat and ate and listened as Nanette told him the road not with letters but with onions and sage in the way a spoon tapped twice for east and once for west. Phoebe wrapped his foot while he sobbed into his wrist where no one could see. Baptiste came back at dusk with a newsprint ribbon around a fish, more dangerous for its words than its bones, and Morel smoothed it with the back of her hand. The paper told of a fire at the Anjou place, of brave neighbors, of gratitude that no children had been lost and that the mistress had shown fortitude becoming to her sex. It mentioned nothing about names of those who cooked the feast. It used the word uprising as if the house had lifted itself. Morel folded the paper and fed it to the coals. They write their stories, she said. We will cook ours. Word, which is faster than law and slower than hunger, moved along ditches and through the field hand grapevine and in the bent kitchen talk that ladies do not hear when they are praising their own restraint. The long table acquired cousins, a stew pit near Bellamy Ridge where a peddler used to boil barrels of dye, a hearthstone under a culvert that Great thought was for turtles, a smoke ring in a ravine that hid itself the way a scar hides under hair. Each kitchen had signals built into the seasoning, more vinegar if the patrols were close, more salt if a child had been taken and a mother needed to taste her own tears to keep from drowning in them. On the next Thanksgiving, newly minted in the newspapers as fashion's religion, Morel sent bread back across 3 counties. In one loaf, Nanette tucked a strip of cloth with knots that meant, wait till dawn. In another, Tombeau pressed the pattern of a deer hoof into the crust, the trail with the broken branch. In a third, Baptiste slid under the heel a sliver of oyster shell, give the watchman his favorite stew and he will leave his post to go piss. They did not call it a massacre. They called it a meal served correctly for the first time, food that took from the master's table his arrogance and fed it to the river. That night, 3 families reached the long table. One had a girl of 10 who carried a potted mint like a relic. Another brought a skillet older than any man in the party, its handle worn smooth by generations who had used it as shield and altar both. The third had nothing but the clothes they had left in and the arm of a woman who had held her elderly mother through a swamp and refused to set her down. Morel met each of them with the same motion, palms out, flour dusted, a welcome so practical it put itself to work. You are home, she said, always adding, for as long as home needs to move. Not all went clean. The great were not fools even if they were men. Sometimes the air around the kitchens trembled with bass voices pretending to be thunder. Men came with dogs and a confidence that made them poor hunters. One night they found the culvert hearth and kicked it to stones. Morel was not there. A younger woman named Lou was, with 2 babies tucked to her chest and a boy who would not be shushed. Lou ran with the babies and the boy ran with his breath, and both reached the long table without shoes. After, Morel sat alone and shook so finely you would have thought she was sifting flour. She shook for the maybe of what had almost happened and for the almost of what kept almost happening. "Your hands are steady," Nanette said, watching her knead. "Let the rest tremble. It keeps truth awake." The mistress's face sometimes visited Morel at night, not accusing, not absolving, only present the way a mirror is present when you pass it. News came folded in fish again. The Anjou place had been half saved, the dining room ruin, the portrait smoked into a kinder expression by soot. Mr. Harrow had been burned at his wrist when the tablecloth took him for a partner. The eldest son had gone north on business, which read to Morel as cowardice seeking a new suit. Then a letter came, not by fish nor by mouth. Zadie brought it in her apron, a single sheet wrapped in oilcloth, the handwriting precise as stitches. "Morel. If gratitude is a language, I have learned a word. S. No signature. But the S traced itself on the underside of a pine table in a kitchen where grease had not reached. The mistress had watched, then. She had seen, maybe not Morel writing but the act of writing. She had written back. "Danger," Baptiste said, looking at the letter. "Not as a condemnation. As a weather report." "Possibility," Morel answered. Then, after a long time, both. The second year, they expanded the map. Baptiste ferried a woman named Alouette whose voice could drunk a room into sleep. She sang at the edges of the kitchens so patrols dozing by their own fires would dream of their mothers and wake embarrassed but still breathing. Nanette taught 2 boys how to make a ruse so slowly the day would ask permission to end before the pot did. Tombeau, the boy who had been wick and tinder, grew into flint, still spark but tempered. He could bank a fire to hold heat like a kept confidence for 2 days. Phoebe delivered twins beneath moss curtains, cutting the cord with a knife that had cleaned fish that morning and blessing them with the unsentimental words of midwives, "Live mean. Live long." Then came the day the great found Big Marais. Not the long table, Providence keeps some secrets even from prayers, but the lit path, the deer's once private runway. They came at noon like a bad argument that refuses to end. Dogs, men, the smell of whiskey on breath that calls itself courage. Morel saw them first from the cypress where she had hung a pot by a chain. She did not run. She lifted the pot calmly from its hook and poured what boiled over the coals, not stew, but water and pine needles. The smoke went sweet. The dogs' noses lifted, confused into silence by the scent of their own childhoods when they slept under porches that smelled of sap. Baptiste emerged from the trees to the path not 20 feet from the Grates Point man. He looked like a fisherman explaining tide. "River rose," he said conversationally. "Took the path. You might sink if you stepped there." He pointed not to a trap, there were no man-traps in the long table's rule, but to a pool of honest mud that would embarrass a man's boots and his pride equally. The point man hesitated because men who hold power hate looking foolish more than they hate being evil. The moment stretched like taffy in a child's hand. Morel stepped out and stood beside Baptiste as if they'd planned to meet neighbors. "Afternoon," she said, and her voice carried the iron of a skillet. "We got nothing for visitors today but tea." The Grates captain narrowed his eyes as if the trees had put a math problem on the board. "You cooking?" he asked, greed and accusation braided in his tone. "Always," Morel answered. "The truth is sharp because it doesn't bend to perform. But not for you." He took 2 steps toward the smoke, then another, and found his boot at the lip of the honest mud Baptiste had indicated. His men snickered. A dog sneezed. The captain stopped, recalculated his dignity, and spat into the mud as if to say he had meant it all along. "You tell anyone come through here," he began. "We will," Morel finished, smiling in a way that did not show teeth. "Tell them to bring bowls. It's a long walk." He stared at her then as men stare at a door that isn't where they expected it to be. In his eyes, she watched something turn, small, ugly, human. Not respect. Recognition of complication. He jerked his chin and the grate withdrew, slogging pride first through leaves. Why not burn them with the kettle? Tombo whispered, furious and young and not wrong in the place where rage is usually right. Because I am building a room, Morel said, not a rumor. Because hot water cools. Because that man will return home and say we were not afraid. That is a seasoning that goes far. The long table thrived. People came. People left. People came back with others. Gratitude moved in the opposite direction of newspapers. The kitchens seeded the woods, then the edges of towns, then the back lots of places where music played on Saturdays and laundries snapped like flags. Every Thanksgiving, they made a meal and then opened the other door. What had been one flame and linen became a light that could not be counted because no one who held a pencil owned it. In the third year, a messenger with a northern coat and a southern mouth came to the long table at dusk with his hat in his hands. He had the word abolition tied to his coat like a badge written by someone else's hand. He spoke quickly, as emissaries do when they think speed is proof. He wanted to organize. He wanted to publish narratives. He wanted to convert your efforts into actionable rhetoric. Morel listened and ladled stew. When he finished, she said, "Eat." He ate. Then she said, "You may write what you like. We will cook what we must. If the two meet on a road, let them nod." He left with a full belly and a softer voice. Later, she saw a pamphlet with a woodcut of a woman at a pot and words like matron of resistance and culinary insurgency. She laughed, then did not. Names are rooms too, sometimes you accept their roof to get the work done in dry weather. The reckoning came not with the grate nor with a pamphlet but with the faces of those left behind that first day. Some had chosen the yard and returned to the house and stood in rooms that had learned a new word. Fragility. Some had told on themselves for choosing, a confession demanded at lash point. Some had swallowed their grief like hot tea and lived. One, a boy named Eli who had spilled cider on Morel's shoes once and grinned about it, had been sold. The mistress's letter mentioned none of this, but the letters. Darkened over the months, the ink pressed harder, the strokes slower. Then the mistress came. Not to the long table, no map would have led her, but to Zadie's cabin, hat brim low, hands gloved not for fashion but to hide their trembling. She knocked the same rhythm Baptiste used. Zadie opened because Zadie believed in offering the choice for people to be better even if they generally declined. "I won't come in," the mistress said. "I need you to carry something to," she stopped and the name snagged like thread on a nail. "To the one who runs the kitchen in the woods. You know who I mean." "I do," Zadie said. The mistress gave her a bundle wrapped in a towel from the front house, soft linen, hem-stitched in that show-off way women use when they are praised more for hems than for decisions. Inside lay a book. The primer. The one with the greasy corner where a girl had learned to cover a letter with her thumb while a shadow in a doorway tried to decide whether to be curious or cruel. "I found it," the mistress said, "or it found me. My husband thinks it was ruined in the fire. He thinks a great many things." Her eyes met Zadie's. "Tell her I know the word is road. I do not know how to walk it. But I know the word." Zadie closed the door on that admission like a woman banking coals against wind. She carried the bundle to the long table at dusk. When Morel opened it, the room changed shape. Not because a book had returned, books go and come, words stay, but because a debt had been admitted without an invoice. Morel set the primer on the table. She drew her chalk over what out of habit, wrote S under the lip, and slid her hand across it the way a person touches the back of someone they once hated and now simply do not know. Then she wiped the letter away. "What you plan?" Ninette asked softly, kneading. "I plan to serve Thanksgiving at the Anjou place next year," Morel said, with a calm that startled the birds. "We will cook. Everyone will eat. And then we will open the other door for those who stayed, because fear is a kind of rope you must cut thrice before it falls. You plan to walk through the front yard? Baptiste asked, not to challenge, to begin measuring the river's temper. I plan to walk through the kitchen, she said. I was born in its mouth. I will use its tongue. Planning is a recipe you do not write down, because paper trembles when the wrong eyes look at it. They spoke in onions and in the length of the pause between two hammer blows, in the number of times Nanette's spoon tapped the rim of a pot, in Tombeau's habit of leaving kindling in bundles of 12 rather than 10. Zadie's cabin became the pantry of their minds. Phoebe sat with women whose men called them mad and taught them the names of their own steadiness. Thanksgiving came like a dare. Morel crossed the backfield at dawn with a basket on her arm and an apron clean as a new promise. Baptiste walked to the river with a string of fish that had agreed to help. Nanette arrived mid-morning with a sack of cornbread that had slept against her rib all night to stay soft. Tombeau carried nothing but the look of a boy returning to the site of a fire he had learned, finally, did not make him a monster. The Anjou place greeted them with a hush that wasn't respect. It was exhaustion. The dining room had been repaired badly and quickly, the new wood looked like a lie someone tried to apologize for with polish. The portrait wore a different frame and a slightly altered face, smoke had softened the grandfather's mouth. The mistress stood in the doorway of the kitchen with her hands bare. She did not try to own the room. She stepped aside. You know why we're here, Morel said, setting her basket down as if setting down a verdict. The mistress nodded. To make a meal that tells the truth. Then, after a breath that cost her something, and to take the ones who choose. Mr. Anjou? Baptiste asked from the doorway like a shadow. Gone on business, the mistress said, and her mouth did not quite lie when it shaped the word. He writes Providence many times in his letters these days. I think he hopes repetition will make a god. The kitchen reached for Morel like a friend who had slept mad at you but decided to forgive before morning. She walked the perimeter with her palm brushing surfaces the way a blind woman reads a room. The stove burned like a question mark. The knives lay in a fan of steel. The table, their secret ledger, held still. Morel slid her hand under its lip and felt the ghost of chalk where she had once written and wiped. She wrote now again, not a letter but a stroke, a line that meant open. They cooked. Not as servants forced to flatter, not as fugitives feeding flight, but as women telling a story to a room that had imagined itself the author. The turkey brined in molasses and orange the way the mistress remembered, but the citrus came from hands that had touched the river and meant to touch it again. The dressing arrived at its texture by a path only Nanette knew. The punch was not the old punch, it was a sober drink with a sober job, and anyone who wanted it strong had to bring their own wise. People gathered, as people do when they smell memory turning itself into dinner. Some from the quarters, some from the lane, a few white neighbors already rehearsing their toasts. Zadie slipped in with a loaf, Alouette stood at the door and sang low so nerves would find chairs, not knives. Phoebe took a seat as if she were waiting for a head to crown. Tombeau moved among the pots with the grace of a man who had studied heat under duress and now enjoyed its company. When all was set, Morel stepped into the doorway between kitchen and dining room, the hinge of the house, the throat of the day. Eat, she said. Not a plea. A law. They ate. The room quieted to the sound of chewing, the reliable choir of forks and plates. After the first wave of appetite receded, voices returned, softer. The mistress did not carve, she served. She moved among her neighbors with a pitcher and eyes that had learned a new arithmetic. Then Morel did the thing she had come to do, the thing that would set the next 10 years in motion like beads sliding true on a string. She took a knife and rapped the table twice. Not loud. Right. Heads turned because human beings always turn toward rhythm that sounds like sense. In this house, she said, words steady as dough rolled even, the blessing has always been said from the head of the table as if the food arrived from the sky into his hands. She did not look toward the chair that usually sat the master. Today the blessing is said in the kitchen, where blessing is made. She turned toward the scullery where the door to the side steps waited, the other door. And after these words, anyone who wishes to follow the blessing where it begun will find the path. She bowed her head. Not because the room demanded it. Because she was speaking to those under the table, those whose names had not been printed on menus or birth records or obituary pages. May the hands that made this meal never be hungry again, she said. May the mouths that ate it learn to say their own names without permission. May doors open when feet arrive. May fear be a rope that frays when pulled and snaps when tugged thrice. Amen. When she raised her head, the room had changed species. Not entirely. Not forever. But enough. A boy stood first, Eli's brother, thin as a wish and twice as stubborn. He walked to the kitchen and put his palm on the table underlip where chalk once lived, as if to take from it a splinter he could carry under his skin. A woman followed, the one with the potted mint. She set the mint on the sill and said quietly, "For your new windows." A field hand with a scar like a comma on his cheek rose and reached for his mother's elbow. 3 more. 5. 7. A neighbor, white, cleared his throat and then said nothing and drank water the way men drink their own complicity. The mistress stood very still. Then she moved to the kitchen and placed her hand on the table the way one touches a coffin and a cradle both. "Go," she said, and the word came out true. They went. Not in a rush. In a procession. Morel led, Baptiste at the door, Nanette shepherding the unsure, Phoebe speaking to fear as if it were a baby, Tombeau holding the primer under his arm like a loaf he meant to share. Zadie took the rear, counting without numbers. Outside, the light lay on the side steps like cloth. The path was what paths always are at their beginning, a question with a direction. The bayou could be heard laughing low. The hawk, if it was the same hawk or if all hawks are one when they write certain words, drew a line above that pointed not north or south but forward. Behind them, some stayed at the table. Some could not read the map yet, and maps refused to force themselves. A neighbor muttered about law. The dining room chairs creaked with a century of habits. At the edge of the yard, a boy ran up, breath jerking like a bellows. "The great," he panted. 2 wagons. Baptiste's mouth ticked. They like to ring the same bell because they don't know any new songs. The procession did not break. Morel's spine did not bend. She turned, not to the house, not to the wagons, but to the kitchen door still open behind them. She stepped back 2 paces, reached under the table, and wrote 1 letter with a pinch of ash from the hearth she carried always in her apron hem. S. 4. Sign. 4. Start. 4. C. For a woman whose name she would never own and who had nonetheless said a word right and meant it. Then she turned and walked. The long table opened its invisible leaf ahead. The woods took them into itself like a story worth hearing twice. The bayou welcomed them as if it had been born for this precise afternoon. They crossed not as fugitives but as founders, each step laying plank over water no one else could see. Behind them, the Anjou place did not burn this time. It learned. The kitchens of 3 counties began drifting in their sleep toward rivers. Thanksgiving, by and by, became a day when doors got tested for shames and kitchens measured the hunger that laws could not explain away. Years later, when people told it, they called it many things: the feast that walked, the day of 2 doors, the kitchen's reckoning. Men wrote pamphlets. Women wrote recipes. Children learned to spell. Open. Before. Obedience. The great rusted into local jokes. Morel grew lines at the corners of her mouth that looked like parentheses holding laughter and sorrow in the same sentence. Tombeau married a woman who could taste rain by sticking out her tongue for a half-second and built hearths for those who needed them. Nanette died at 96 with flour on her knuckles and 4 generations making dressing that tasted like the memory of a path through trees. Baptiste lived long enough to see boats with names he laughed at and then respected. Phoebe left on the same evening as 2 babies were born. The wind carried her name over the bayou and set it down gently on a stump like a midwife setting down her scissors. And the mistress? She wrote 3 more letters, all signed S, all saying little and much. She taught a girl to read in a pantry and told no one and asked no credit. One winter morning she left a loaf on Zadie's step with the crust scored in a pattern Morel recognized, 3 cuts, 1 long, 2 short. Soon, at dusk, Morel went. They embraced as the strangers who have made each other unavoidable. No one asked forgiveness. They traded recipes for leaving and for staying. They stood in a kitchen, the cleanest room for honesty, and agreed that gratitude without justice is bad gravy, it looks glossy and betrays the meat. Then the mistress went her way and Morel hers, and both were watched by the same hawk, who, if asked, would have said it was simply writing down what it saw, people learning to bless from the correct room. On the last Thanksgiving of her life, Morel rose before the hawk and touched the table she had built from cypress with her palm like a reader waking a book. Children and grandchildren slept in pallets around the clearing, the long table no longer secret but still moving as kitchens should. She drew a letter under the lip, S, and did not wipe it away. We keep some signs, she told the morning. For those who come late and hungry. Then she stepped to the door that has no hinges, looked at the river that has no master, and smiled. Eat, she said to the world, and meant it. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.